Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the stories we've all been taught about civilization, innovation, and history. Because from the ancient world all the way to modern boardrooms, the narratives we just take for granted are rarely the whole truth. We're going to dive deep into the hidden mechanics of survival and control. We'll look at how historical records get completely rewritten, how massive power grabs are cleverly disguised, and how some cultures manage to survive by completely reinventing themselves. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the myth of inequality, engineering the excluded classes, profit disguised as purpose, and finally, survival through reinvention. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Myth of Inequality, Rethinking the Price of Civilization.
So, we're pretty much all caught that as early villages grew into sprawling cities, massive inequality just naturally followed, right? The standard narrative insists that once you have agriculture and really dense populations, you simply have to have rigid social classes, sacred kings, and poverty. It's just a price of progress. But historical reality completely challenges that core belief. What if those things weren't an inevitable byproduct of civilization at all?
While we assume that cities require kings and poverty, archaeological evidence from literally 10,000 years ago shows early global villages thriving with complex math, advanced metallurgy, and incredibly comfortable housing, yet they completely lacked rigid social classes or rulers. For over 4,000 years after the invention of agriculture, people were innovating like crazy, inventing things like the potter's wheel and the sail, all without raising up a permanent class of bosses to rule over everyone else.
When you look across the ancient world, the evidence is honestly astonishing. Down in the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro housed massive populations with excellent sanitation, but they completely lacked aggrandizing art or palaces for kings. Then, around 250 AD, the huge city of Teotihuacan in Mexico literally turned its back on human sacrifices and pyramid temples, and instead focused on housing its citizens in spacious villas with gorgeous murals. And my absolute favorite, Tlaxcala. They were an indigenous republic that would periodically publicly whip their politicians just to break their egos and remind them who was really in charge.
Now, contrast that ancient push for equality with some modern reports from journalist Gil Duran. In his analysis of what some are calling the Nerd Reich, he details how certain tech billionaires today are actively trying to market corporate autocracy and rigid inequality as our inevitable future. According to Duran's research, these folks actually view democracy as an obsolete software system. They advocate for breaking countries into corporate zones, these so-called network states, and promote a strict hierarchy where wealthy technologists act as absolute rulers. It's a stark reminder that inequality is so often a manufactured goal, rather than some natural law.
Moving on to Section 2. Engineering the excluded classes, erasing and rewriting origins. Did you know that even beloved fairy tales like Cinderella originated from a much different reality? The earliest recorded variant of the story, written by the Greek historian Strabo in the 1st century BC, was actually about a woman named Rhodopis. She was a Thracian woman of color, and ancient Thracians were historically noted as having much darker skin than the Greeks. But over time, her true ethnic identity and origins were essentially whitewashed and erased by the Hellenization of ancient Egypt. It just proves how easily history gets overwritten. And we see this exact same rewriting of history happening in modern America. The illusion today is that public housing was fundamentally built for the poorest communities of color. But the historical reality? It was originally created almost exclusively to give poor white citizens a massive leg up into the middle class. According to historical sources, the incredible wealth generated by these government-guaranteed housing programs in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was engineered entirely by design. The FHA and the GI Bill used incredibly strict lending and underwriting criteria that effectively benefited white families, while systematically excluding people of color from participating in this generational wealth boom. The inequality was engineered directly into the blueprints of the system itself.
Which brings us to Section 3. Profit disguised as purpose, how massive power grabs are cloaked in noble excuses.
Let's talk about one of history's most famous myths, the Crusades. We're taught they were this deeply religious mission to save Jerusalem, but the reality is they were way less about faith and much more about solving a massive European feudal crisis. The system back then left generations of heavily armed younger knights completely landless and frankly very violent. The Crusades gave them a much-needed outlet, while simultaneously opening up staggering wealth in Eastern luxury trade routes for Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. And think about the logistical nightmare of moving vast amounts of physical wealth all the way to the Middle East. It was so difficult that it actually led the Knights Templar to invent modern banking. A pilgrim could deposit their gold in London, get a coded letter of credit, and then withdraw those funds safely in Jerusalem. Meaning, this holy war was actually the laboratory where Western capitalism and international banking were prototyped.
To really understand the financial weight of all this, look at this number: 85,000 silver marks. That was the staggering Venetian debt that completely derailed the Fourth Crusade. When the crusading army couldn't pay Venice for the ships they built, those Christian soldiers were diverted to brutally sack the Christian city of Constantinople, arguably the richest city in the world at the time, simply to pay off their Venetian merchant creditors. The holy mission was entirely hijacked by a collection agency.
And this idea of profit disguised as purpose, it isn't just ancient history. Recently, an unauthorized Texas oil company called Greenland Energy pushed to drill right in the untouched Arctic. They claimed they had permission to bring their equipment ashore, completely bypassing Greenland's strict national ban on oil exploration. They operated entirely under the guise of energy progress and local cooperation.
The reality of that standoff was incredibly dramatic. Despite the local government's total ban, the company somehow managed to illegally drop off 15 shipping containers of equipment. The Greenland government literally had to threaten intervention by police and the Danish military. It sparked massive resistance, with local muskox hunters pledging to blockade the waters with their hunting dinghies. It perfectly mirrors those ancient territorial expansions, where the desires of the powerful simply try to steamroll local sovereignty for a quick profit.
Let's move to our final segment, Section 4, Survival Through Reinvention, Subverting Traditional Power.
Most ancient peoples define themselves by their land, their physical temples, and their kings. If an invading army burned your temple and killed your king, your civilization just dissolved into history. But as this timeline of devastating exiles shows, the Jewish people faced complete annihilation time and time again. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple, and later, the Romans destroyed the second temple and crushed massive revolts. Yet, miraculously, they absolutely refused to disappear.
Instead of mourning their lost world and fading away, they did something truly revolutionary. Over in Babylon, completely lacking their temple and land, they took their history, their laws, and their memory, and they wrote them all down. They compiled the Torah and literally invented the concept of the synagogue. By doing this, they created a portable homeland that allowed their identity to survive anywhere in the world, totally unattached to physical borders. They realized a profound truth, captured perfectly by this idea: you move your homeland into a book. Physical buildings can burn, and kings can certainly be killed, but ideas, covenants, and texts, they can outlast any kingdom on earth.
And they had to do it all over again centuries later. Even amidst the horrific destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD, leaders like Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai were already negotiating the future. Legend says he was literally smuggled out of the burning city inside a coffin. He convinced the Romans to let him establish a new school of Jewish law in Yavna, which fundamentally shifted Judaism from priests and physical sacrifices over to rabbis and the deep study of texts.
And this brilliant text, the Talmud, became their new constitution. Now, it isn't just a rigid list of rules. It's a sprawling, multi-century record of rabbinic argument. It actually preserves minority opinions just in case future generations might need them, treating disagreement itself as something sacred. They proved that true endurance comes from turning argument into culture, and memory into an unbreakable form of resistance.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've seen how inequality is so often engineered, how histories get completely erased, and how true survival comes from refusing to accept the narrative that's simply handed to you. The history we're taught is rarely the whole truth. So, if absolute power relies on controlling the story, what narratives are you ready to question, and how will you rewrite your own story today? Thanks so much for learning with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.